Why am I being shouted at by some old boy every time I visit a new surf spot? Why am I being asked to leave the surf spot every time I paddle out? Chances are you've experienced localism. What is localism? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? James from Kirra Point Surf School, and today we're going to discuss all things localism.
Where do you think you're going, huh? This spot is for locals only, all right? So you better get back in your car, turn around, go the other way, or we will pound you.
What is localism? A good starting point comes from Kelly Slater, the GOAT, in that localism is a pecking order. An alternative view from Windy, one of my favourite forecasting apps, describes localism as a negative view or the negative attitude from surfers towards visiting surfers. Build on the GOAT's definition on what localism is. Typically, the older generation who have spent time at a surf spot and put their time in at that particular surf spot tend to get the first pick in waves. My personal perspective on localism is that there needs to be some form of respect paid to the older generation that came before you, as well as providing respect to people who try and come and visit your surf spots if they follow a few simple tips, which will be mentioned later in this video. I can almost guarantee you, unless the local is an absolute dickhead, that these tips will help you navigate the lineup, hopefully build yourself a bit of a relationship with the locals and end up with you catching a good number of waves in those surf spots. I'm sure we've all experienced the angry local out in the lineup, shouting at everyone, dropping in on everyone, and not providing any sort of reasonable attempt to provide other people waves while just taking everything for themselves. Stab recently conducted an interview with a bunch of professional surfers on their perspectives on what localism is and whether it's a bad or a good thing. Most of the time, the surfers provided a positive view of what localism is, but provided some examples of what they don't like when locals do in the surf. Nate Fletcher provided a really good definition that I think most closely aligns with my view on localism. Nate said that there's nothing worse than being shouted at or treated like rubbish in the water. In order to give respect or get respect, you've got to give respect. And he went on to further elaborate that when someone is doing something wrong in the water, the way to handle that situation is not to shout at the person, but to rather take them aside, speak to them politely on what you believe they may be doing wrong. People are way more receptive to feedback in this light. Like Nate, he also went on to mention that he doesn't like to have a particular surf spot that he surfs every single day. He prefers to surf different surf spots or the best waves on the day, which is very similar to what I like to do. I consider Snapper my local spot on the Gold Coast, but I don't limit myself to surfing that one spot every day. I like to move around the coast and surf the best waves day to day. This isn't necessarily something that everyone agrees on, this perspective on localism, but I think it's one of the fairest perspectives. If you're surfing one spot every single day, that's fine, but it can get a little bit boring. I think it's helpful to go into a history of why localism developed or how it developed and the different ways that localism have been implemented at different surf spots. Localism started in the 60s and 70s when surfing began to gain popularity and surfers became protective of their surf spots from overcrowding. One of the most iconic forms of localism that I'm sure most people have heard of is how localism was implemented in Hawaii, or Hawaii, if I'm saying that right. I remember seeing videos as a kid of people getting the absolute snot beat out of them on the beach in Hawaii, and I just remember thinking to myself, fighting over waves? As we all know, Pipeline is the most dangerous surf spot in the world, with 13 recorded fatalities and over 1,000 injuries and near deaths over the years. Mad props to the lifeguards who work the beaches on the North Shore. You guys are insane. Safety, as explained by the Hawaiians, was the main reason why localism was brought into effect in Hawaii. A bunch of professional surfers coming into North Shore over winter from year to year meant there were drop-ins, dangerous things happening out in the water, and the Hawaiians felt like it was their job to take back the surf spot and implement some order into the lineup. I'm not sure if you've heard of the infamous Black Shorts crew and the whistle that they used to use when implementing their localism. What would happen is if a surfer dropped in, misbehaved, or did something dangerous in the water, the whistle would get blown, this individual would get singled out and be politely asked to leave. Some other notable heavy local surf spots was Santa Monica, or otherwise Dogtown. I'm sure we've all seen the documentary or the video which outlines how rough that neighbourhood used to be. How has localism changed over the years? Surfing historically developed as a counterculture, with surfers being viewed, and to be honest, they typically still are, a bunch of degenerates, including me, for the most part. I think localism in some aspects developed from a small-minded view of the world, and although it is now developing into a more refined and understandable law that varies from surf spot to surf spot, I do think there's still some negativity that occurs through just big egos, big personalities thinking they own the joint. To be honest, I'm not innocent from being a bit of a dickhead in the water, and I've been extremely frustrated over the years too, just from some outrageously stupid and dangerous things that have happened to me in the water. As the surf industry has become a lot more professional, I've found that although localism is still alive and well, violence is definitely less and less frequent in the water. Main reason, I think, is there's a large female presence in the water nowadays. There are cameras absolutely everywhere you go, and society is generally less and less accepting of violence as a means to settle disputes. Now, let's talk about some of my personal experiences with localism and how I think localism should be implemented in the water before we go into some tips on how to navigate and what I think are just localism no-nos. Let's start with one of my favourite surf spots ever and what I consider to be my local, Snapper Rocks. A warm climate, a big city, and some of the most accessible and user-friendly waves in the world means Snapper has the biggest crowds you will ever see at a surf spot. I think the localism at Snapper is developed from a really high level of surfing, and a lot of people can't really manage behind the rock at Snapper, as well as the fact that there are thousands of people in the water, and for locals to get waves and have a fun session with a number of waves in that session, it's almost impossible to get waves and have that kind of a session without taking some waves from other people. Snapper is really, really bad in the sense that it's just a dog-eat-dog world out there. You will witness more drop-ins out at Snapper than I think at any other surf spot in the world. And to be honest, I think if we were in Hawaii, there would be some repercussions for some of those behaviours out in the water. The Australian Police Force is pretty onto it, and surf rage, as it's called in the local headlines here, is not acceptable. So people find other ways around that. Another experience I had with localism recently, I flew down for a swell in Sydney to surf a wave Deadman's. It's such an insane wave, and it only breaks a couple times a year, so the locals are very hesitant to share their waves with me. Even one of my best mates, Tommy. After speaking to Tommy and getting an understanding of localism, I didn't necessarily agree with what they said, in that we don't want to really share waves with people who fly in, even though we're still accepting, welcoming. I felt very welcome out in the water there. He and his mates and the local crew took the waves that they wanted. Looking back at how they implement their localism, these guys live and breathe this wave, and I can completely understand why they want to be so protective of these waves and are hesitant to share. One wave every half an hour to an hour, one swell every 1 to 2 years. This wave is a special treat to them, and I get it. Sharing isn't always caring. One of my most negative experiences I've ever had with localism actually happened in Hawaii. If any of you have been there and surfed the wave pipe, you would know the local crew out there are pretty intense humans, and to navigate them is a bit of a challenge. To be honest, I would always go out there, tail between my legs, not even look at the waves that the locals paddle for. And one particular west swell, if you know pipe, a west swell means it's predominantly pipeline. There's not many rights out there. A particular goofy foot local was having a go at me for snaking him all the time or paddling up his inside because he thought I was trying to take the lefts off him. But in all honesty, I was just trying to find any wave I could, and I was going on rights and some closeouts for the most part, just so I could get a wave out there. After explaining that to the local, he understood where I was coming from and was cool in the lineup. Communicate with the locals and be calm about it and explain to them what you're doing. If I paddled out there, paddled up his inside and took these lefts off him, I can tell you there would have been a very different end to this story.
Very quick, very effective.